right. Hey, everybody. Welcome. I'm just so happy to be here today. What is today? Today is the 18th?
I think it's the 19th.
19th. Today's the 19th. So it's December 19th, 2024. And I just want to thank everybody for joining the Sober Voyager Podcast. Special thanks to God and my higher power for even getting me on this journey. And it's been quite a journey. But what we're here to talk about today is something really important. Check this out. This book right here I've got with me. You guys have seen what we posted out on our website. We made a little really cool little card. I got Cody Peterson, and Cody Peterson is the author of The Shadow of a Figure of Light, The Archetype of the Alcoholic, and The Journey to Enlightenment. All right, Cody, what's going on?
Not much. Just loving the weather here in Huntington Beach.
Well, hey, we'll start with this. You know, one of the things I got to tell you, man, I'm going to start with just kind of doing something. And really, we were just talking about this earlier about podcast being about you. This really podcast is about you, your book, your journey to enlightenment. You know, when I came up with the idea of the Sober Voyager podcast, you know, I chose the word sobriety because of the typical archetype, right? The grateful alcoholic or the sober alcoholic. One of the words I kind of, as I was reading through your book, at first I was like, oh, this guy's a Jungian. He's like really kind of going down the path of this. And it really opened up this rabbit hole for me of this, like literally a journey into your book, into all kinds of areas of the 12 steps and the idea of what my myth. I started looking at the word myth, and you use all these words that literally I've never even heard of before, or even gave much thought about. And so first I want to thank you for opening my mind to a new experience. There's a prayer that we say at the beginning of one of my meetings. You've probably heard this. It's not really in AA meetings, but it's called the set aside prayer. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh yeah.
Set aside everything I think I know about myself, my disease, the steps, and especially you, right? For an open mind. And I'm going to be honest, I started reading your book and my mind got closed. Right out of the gate, I started getting a closed mind, thinking, psychology versus spirituality, God we trust, and all this stuff. Where my myth has lied, and I guess you could, I don't know if it's the right way to term it, but the archetype of my alcoholism and my recovery and the mythology behind that I've created for myself is kind of like what I was looking at. It kind of opened up to me more as I started reading through the rest of your book. So that being said, I want to thank you for, first, like I said, when I said I want to thank God, it was because for really finding that, to have an open mind so I can have a new experience. And this is what I want to kind of convey to the audience is, you know what, set aside everything you think you know, have a new experience, not just with yourself, with the steps, with your higher power, whatever that looks like. And we can start the journey of recovery and have a new experience. And so that's what we hope to have today. And again, I just wanted to, kind of start out with that and thank you for allowing me to have you on the show. So why don't we first start out with a little bit about Cody and your personal background. Can you tell me or tell us a little bit about what led you to explore the journey of the archetype of the alcoholic, and just kind of give us your story a little bit?
Sure. I grew up in an alcoholic home. And so I felt like I was kind of destined to participate in booze and alcohol and drugs. And I actually had a spiritual experience when I was a young man. I was, I think, 17 or 18, and I started going to church. And because I had to hang up the towel with the drink, and my parents
at 17?
My parents had kicked me out and stuff. So I didn't do any recovery at that point, but I found a spiritual experience within like a Christian church. So, and it's interesting because it was an experience pretty similar to Bill's white light experience, where the clean mountain breeze came blowing through his hospital bed room or whatever. But that didn't last for very long. Like in Bill's story, after 6 months, he's in Akron, Ohio, ready to drink again, right? And that's about right with those kind of white light experiences. So I was able to stay away from drinking and stuff for about 5 years, but I got tangled up in it again, and ended up out there, couple second-degree felonies, rehab, in and out of multiple 12-step fellowships. And then I finally ended up homeless in Vegas in 2013. And I had another spiritual awakening, you could say. I like to say now that, the objective psyche held up a mirror and I could see myself for what I'd become, which was basically a deadbeat dad,
So that's the archetype. Because archetype, so explain, so go through it, you became a deadbeat dad, so that's one archetype, right?
Sure.
So what is, give us the definition of just the archetype of alcoholics. What are name a few of them. One of them is a deadbeat dad.
Sure. I mean, yeah, so there's sort of these, so archetypes, Jung would have defined, he kind of says archetypes are like these fundamental ideas, right? Like Bill Wilson says that deep down inside of every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. So God's an archetype.
Okay.
So an alcoholic archetype is it's that there's, and so the way I'm looking at alcoholism and drug addiction is through this lens, right? So it's not really, like Gabor Mate might say something like, alcoholism comes from unresolved childhood trauma, right? Mm-hmm. So, and yeah, probably some of it does, right? But there's actually a level deeper that Jung would explore, which was the archetypes. So those aren't necessarily like my personal traumas. It's more of this this sort of collective experience that we all share. So we see for example, the archetype of the alcoholic is apparent in Western culture because in certain characters, right? If Shakespeare's Falstaff is a good example. There's Walter White is kind of an example. So there's, the Sopranos, like Tony Soprano, that's kind of the archetype of the alcoholic. It's sort of a dark trickster element. And it kind of the archetype of the alcoholic is always sort of carousing with prostitutes and hanging out with criminals and using intoxication. And they're always these witty characters. Falstaff was Shakespeare's wittiest character. But the archetype then is something that's sort of common to everybody, right? Not just one individual in particular. So I say that the archetype of the alcoholic sort of permeates Western culture now because, I mean, one way of looking at it is the whole civilization is powerless over alcohol, right?
Right. Well, I mean, it depends, I guess, if you're looking at it from a perspective of unmanageability, and the only time you really become aware that you're an alcoholic is when your life becomes unmanageable.
Right.
So I guess the journey to your journey on getting into, I want to kind of go back because at the beginning of the book, it's it starts out. Tell us about Carl Jung. What does it mean? What is the Jungian, you're part of an organization, right? How did you get involved there? What led you down that path? Because somehow going down that path has led you to write this book, and then your own personal experience and your journey through recovery, addiction, and having a spiritual experience, the vital spiritual experience that is talked about specifically in Jung's reference to Roland Hazard about the key element, the one thing that he was missing of all the things that Carl Jung had tried to work with Roland over. He couldn't effectively produce the results that he wanted, so he essentially said, hey, look, you're beyond human aid. You need what I'm going to just a vital spiritual experience. And if there's anything, I think that in all of the, because when I looked at, and this is why another reason I want to thank you is because I started reading your book and it took me down this rabbit hole, essentially, of the myth of AA and the myth of these relationships associated in it. And I only say myth because I started looking up what that meant and how you were referring to it. And I started really kind of going down that rabbit hole, and that took me in a whole nother direction. And I started seeing my own myth, the one that I've created, the life prior to Alcoholics Anonymous, the one that I created, the version of myself that got me to where I was at, which leads me in now. There's another rabbit hole when you talk about the devil, and there's this. I have that page. Well, I'm going to read some of that too because I think it's interesting. Some of the things that you at the ends of and I'll tell you, to be honest with you, I didn't read the whole book. What I do with a lot of books is I read the end. I read the end of every chapter. I read the beginning of every chapter. And I go, okay, this is a chapter I want to dig into. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's important too because any kind of textbook for living, like the big book, doesn't have. If you try to read something from beginning to end, it's important. It makes sense if it's a fictional or storybook or something. But when you're digging into details like this, you can find a little bit of something and go, hey, now I really want to focus on that because you're going to have to come back and forth. And if you get this book on his website and read it, you'll see that there's so much cool information that will take you down the rabbit hole that will help enlighten you and that's the goal, right? To get a book that's going to help create a new space and a new experience for people, right?
Yeah.
So take me to your interest in Carl Jung, how you went from, okay, I am a guy, you kind of described a little bit about what happened, where you started at 17, your parents sent you to church, you had somewhat of an experience, and then you fast forwarded to you're in Las Vegas, right? And that's the impact moment. Something happened there, right, that brought you to your knees again. Mm-hmm. And from that, you've had an experience that sent you down this path. How long have you been sober now? What year was
11 years.
11 years, okay. Yep. All right. And somehow, in that 11 years, you decided to write a book and then get into this psychological side of it and start really delving into, like, you spend the first 3 chapters talking about the relationship between Jaime mm-hmm. and his experience in Taos, New Mexico, right?
Yeah.
And you spent a lot of time on that, and I'm trying to understand a little bit how the spiritual experience that they were trying to acquire there, how that led you down to this path, and how did you get into Carl Jung, and did that play a part into it?
Sure. So I was drawn to Jung through reading Joseph Campbell. I started, I don't know, I think in 2017 or 18, I was like, man, I need to start doing my 11th step better. So I started reading a lot, and I picked up Joseph Campbell, who I'd been introduced to in college. And Campbell talks about myths and symbols and all this stuff, and I really like Campbell's perspective, and he's a huge Jungian, right? So finally I capitulated and was like, all right, I'm going to check out some Carl Jung. And I was blown away from the first page. So I basically read 7 of Jung's books right in a row. And I started taking notes on those books in my big book, right? Okay. My book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And essentially then I just felt compelled to start writing. I was like, this stuff is too good to not share. And it occurred to me that nobody in the program had ever really read Carl Jung because it's just too goddamn heady, right?
Well, I mean, for sure. I'll tell you what, just so you know, if you're going to read this book, make sure you got your Google open so you can look up all the words. There's I've got a whole, I'm like, man, my vocabulary sucks because I was reading I had to having a new experience, it was kind of cool, dude, because I had to it was a little too much. Yeah. I had to, some of the words you're using, I don't understand, and we'll talk about those later too. But okay, anyway, you're writing your big book, Carl Jung.
Yeah, taking notes in the big book. Joseph Campbell says that for him, highlighting books was the way he meditated, and I was like, oh, that feels good because I like to highlight books. That's just the books I read are the kind that you need to write in to understand. The kind that require a dictionary and so I just started kind of cobbling together basically what was a long essay. I never thought it would turn into a book, and then I had an editor read it, and he was like, hey, this is really good. And by that time, I think I had 100,000 words written or something, and so I started to put it together and got a real dedicated editor. And what that first version of the book was the last part of so it was chapters 5 through 17 or whatever. So It's really just a deep dive into the 12 steps, looking at the 12 steps as a myth, and then examining them through a Jungian lens, right? That's what the last half of the book does. I thought it would be a good idea to have a Jungian, an actual Jungian analyst, look at the book and just give me feedback if I was getting the ideas right, because I wasn't reading any really side stuff. I was just getting it all straight from Jung. And so while we were going through that together with him, his name is Dr. Stephen Herman. He lives in the Bay Area. So he actually, about a month into that, he said, hey, Cody, I think you need to see this essay I wrote in 2014. I never published it, but I somehow think it's going to tie stuff in. So he showed me the essay, and I read it, and it was an essay about Jaime de Angelo, mm-hmm. and his participation with Jung as they went to Taos. And so
what year was that?
That happened in 1925. Okay, right. And this is really what kind of blew the lid off and got me some recognition within the Jungian community. Probably got me some of the blurbs on the back of the book. So a lot of people in recovery, some higher ups or whatever, if you want to call them that, right? They're very interested in this story. Because with Dr. Herman's essay and then the research that I had done, I was able to show that essentially, to be really brief, so Carl Jung, he decided that he was going to go searching for his own myth, right? That was his language. He had met William James in 1909 at Clark University, and he was blown away by William James. William James was a super spiritual dude, right? He's
the American version, for those of you who don't know, right? So he's the American version of, say, Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung from Europe. And then in the United States, we've got William James, and he's our claim to fame, right?
He is, right? Because Bill Wilson read William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Sure. So, but what most people don't know is that William James also had a profound influence on Carl Jung's own spiritual quest. So James influenced Bill Wilson and Carl Jung.
Right.
So it's kind of this intermixed web, right? Because so Jung goes out searching for his own myth. He meets Jaime d'Angelo in 1923, basically the first hippie, right? Jaime was eating mushrooms out in the mountains of Northern California on the eastern slopes of Mount Shasta. With a very small Indian tribe up there, Native Americans, and he had befriended some people in Taos, New Mexico, and Jung decided he wanted to go to Taos. So in 1925, Jaime took Jung to Taos, and Jung, he's on this like decades long quest to discover his own myth of meaning. And while he's in Taos, it happens for him. He's speaking with one of the elders. The elder tells him about his myth. And it just really struck Jung that he still didn't have his own connection to the universe, essentially.
Right.
And so a couple months later, Jung goes to Africa. Jaime goes back to the Bay Area and just lives the life of an alcoholic and ends up dying. He dies of prostate cancer, but he was a bad alcoholic. He got strung out on pills. But meanwhile, Jung goes to Africa and has a full-blown spiritual awakening. And that happened in February, March of 1926, and this is where it ties back into the 12 steps, is that Jung comes home from Africa. He says it's the most pivotal moment of his life, pretty much, and 8 weeks later, he meets Roland Hazard. And Roland Hazard was a drunk, just like Jaime was a drunk, right? And Jung had this firsthand experience with Jaime, and so when Roland comes, and he's like, hey, I can't stop drinking, Jung says, you need to have a vital spiritual experience,
well, I think, it's funny you say that, too, because you're kind of got a good role right here. And I was reading up on that stuff, and this is the part that I thought was really interesting, because it was more or less, and this is a question I have for you, because Roland Hazard, the backstory is he's a very wealthy man. His family is deep, deep wealth.
Yeah,
years,
big money.
Hundreds of years. And we're talking 1929, and they were basically dug in Rhode Island.
Bro.
Big money. And so one of the things and so they're the ones that sent him to Europe to go because nobody would work with Roland because they thought he was a lost cause, Sigmund Freud. I kind of did. So one of the things that I loved about the book and doing this, it made me dig a little deeper.
Good.
You made me think a little bit more. And honestly, I think everybody should, especially people in recovery, should go a little deeper. Because once you've been sober for a minute, you can kind of get bored with what we got, and we need to have a new experience, right?
Yeah.
Because even us talking about it right now, to me, that's a vital spiritual experience. Two guys getting together and talking about the creation or the myth or whatever it is that we're going to call it right now is a way of having another spiritual experience, because you gain insight and enlightenment from just discussing things like this. But let me ask you this. So one of the things that, as I read this, I thought, what I come across all the time in newcomers and Alcoholics Anonymous, people that are entitled, that have a lot of money, that, they're so wealthy. The last thing they're going to end up doing is being in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and meeting with a newcomer who comes from the park bench.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, now the experience that you're expressing that was acquired in Africa, and now there's a chapter in here called what is it called? It's the one about the mycelia?
Mythological mycelia.
Mythological mycelia. Yeah, mycelia. Yeah. And I go, okay, there's another one of those words. Now, I've done plenty of mushrooms in my time. I by the time I was in 8th grade, I was already frying on LSD and mushrooms in a big way.
At school.
At school, yeah. Digi school, it could be completely just like having the best time of my life. So I get and understand that whole spiritual awakening, and I feel like I was lucky enough to have that as a kid, not even knowing that something was taking place. But going back to the experience with Roland Hazard, Carl Jung, because it's the term vital spiritual experience is, and it's kind of quoted in the letter that the correspondence in '61 between Bill Wilson and Carl Jung as they start corresponding later on.
Yeah.
But at the time, the thing that was missing is what I was getting at. And I looked at it and go, so somebody who is entitled, has a lot of money, that's struggling with their recovery, and because literally they have too much resources, and they don't have the humility, right, to do what it takes, the ground, the footwork, I'm going to clean the ashtrays. And meetings nowadays is like, hey, you know what, you want to stay sober, go, there's the ashtray. And they don't have ashtrays at meetings anymore, but be the door greeter, be the bell guy, do the thing. And so a lot of times, and I'll tell you, from the myth that I've created, a lot of the spiritual experience comes from self-service and self-sacrifice, right? And so a lot of times people who aren't willing to go to that level can't have that vital spiritual experience that can only come from self-sacrifice, constant thought of others, and thinking less of yourself and more of other people. So then one of the things that I thought immediately when I started reading and digging into this is like one of the things that Roland might have missed was that he was looking for another type of spiritual experience that was a synthetic experience that would trigger it in the way that we're saying Carl Jung did, right? So nowadays, in the environment we live in today, a lot of people are doing microdosing, and they're effectively using it in therapy treatments, and and I will say from my experience, I believe that microdosing stuff, that I have never done it, but I know that from what my experience was then, I could see how it can benefit others, because I know that in my recovery, I don't have the corner on the market. I don't say that, hey, this God that I have or these 12 steps that I have is the only way to do it. I don't really believe that. I used to. That was my myth then. Mm-hmm. But now as I look at it now and I'm going forward and I'm reading your book, I'm going, so where and how did you tie in the importance of that experience that was induced, right, as being, is that something that you thought that maybe, as Carl Jung tells Roland Hazard, hey, listen, based upon your history and your inability to do all these things, maybe because you were too entitled, how do you think, and I read the letter and I thought maybe in the letter, because he said he made a point to tell Bill, I didn't want to be able to say everything I could say back then to Roland because he wasn't in a place that you're in. Mm-hmm. Do you think it was that he wanted to say you need to have because they went to Mexico and did the spiritual experience, right?
Yeah, so...
But they didn't effectively have that effect that we're, you know...
I mean, Roland did go to New Mexico. He bought land down there. And he also went to Africa, but he ended up drinking and was in the hospital for 6 months in Africa. Then he moved to London for 9 months and partied with high society people. And then he ended up in the hospital in 1932, once again, just completely broken.
Right.
And he gets involved with the Oxford group then. And the Oxford group, actually, one of their fundamental tenets was to be selfless. Also, Dr. Silkworth, his moral psychology was all about being less self-centered and trying to be of service to other people. But what they had missed was this thing that Jung had experienced for himself, right? Which is the vital spiritual experience. Jung called it his own personal myth, over and over in his own, in his writings. Wilson calls it a vital spiritual experience, but Bill Wilson didn't even know Roland Hazard, right?
Right.
So he sort of quotes Carl Jung in the Big Book as saying a vital spiritual experience, but that's just the way Wilson understood the message that made it to him through Ebby.
Right.
So, but the important thing is that, Dr. Silkworth understood step one, and he also understood being selfless and trying to help other people. But there was this other essence of this kind of deeper sort of numinous experience that.
Oh, that's that word, numinous.
Yeah, numinous.
Tell us the definition. So break it down. The numinous experience. Yeah. Like that's all over in the book.
Yeah.
What is it, numinous? Tell the readers, tell the listeners, tell the watchers.
Yeah. So numinosity would be something like the power, right? So Bill Wilson says the lack of power was our dilemma, but where and how are we to find this power? So that power is numinosity. Right? It's sort of like the electrical current of spirituality or something like that. And so, that's what that means. So essentially, Carl Jung spent his life studying the numinous and how to experience the numinous and understood that to overcome many types of neuroses, depression, all types of psychosis, alcoholism, drug addiction, an experience of the numinous is the most effective way.
So that's through experience.
Well, it's
when
I was experience.
It's the spiritual experience. In your book, when you talked about that, the numinous that comes from having burnt one's life to the ground, and through that experience, then the vital spiritual experience can take place only after having had some type of annihilation event, some type of event that transpires that leads you to that awakening, essentially.
Right, and that's where Wilson Wilson was what 3-4 years sober when he started to write the book, but he had figured out quite a bit about this overall process that Jung spent Jung's such a genius person. I mean, his collected works are this wide. I mean, it's insane the amount of material that he put out into the world. And he talks a lot about this process the same way Bill Wilson does. There's a meme in crypto. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's the left curve, right curve meme, and then there's like the mid curver. And so like on the left, there's this sort of like, not as smart person, and then on the right or on the right there's a Jedi, right? And then in the middle there's these other people that are like, no, you can't do it that way. That's not how it works. So Wilson's on the left. He's a left curver, right? Mm-hmm. He's like, no, it's really simple. You just do this. And Jung's over here like a Jedi describing this thing in profound detail. We're lucky enough to have stumbled into the left curve there.
So, well, it's like interesting. I think it was on page, wait a minute, 182. Do you know that page?
I got my book. Let's check it out.
Let's look up page 182 really quick. I'll read it because I like the sound of my voice. It says, okay, here's the paragraph 180. You know what's funny is there's this, I started like doing this thing where I'd read the page of your book that meant something to me, and then I'd go look it up in the AA book. And 181 and 180, so like if you look at 181 in the big book, it's the end of, I think it's Dr. Bob's Nightmare, where he says, if you're an atheist, agnostic, a skeptic, or have any other form of intellectual pride. And then I thought, oh, he's got a page close to that. And so I had to go back and look at 181 so I could actually go into, this is that part where it says it's the Thirst of Wholeness chapter. Mm-hmm. But and this is an interesting thing because you use the word devil. It says, thus the devil and his evil power is indicative of many things, not the least of which is our overarching instinct for ease and comfort. The desires of the flesh that, when faithfully followed to their bittersweet ends, induce the necessary spiritual serving. Gods and devils are nothing more than masks that the numinosum adorns in its interactions with the ego as we make our way toward the threshold. The same antimonial energy reflected by the trickster and the alcoholic, illustrative of the coupling of our highest religious experience with our most depraved state of being. So while it appears to the uninitiated that the devilish beasts outside the temple were placed there by the presence, with a capital P, within to keep the immoral and unworthy from passing. And then in the quotes it says, the way we had assumed Yahweh used the flaming sword to guard the way of the tree of life.
That's a handful. You want me to explain it?
Yeah.
No, it's I love it. I love this part.
Yeah.
And this is where, we really get to go, as 12-steppers, we're very lucky because we understand the power that we discovered in the darkness, even if we're not fully conscious of it, right? But like we hear in the rooms all the time, G-O-D,
yes,
the gift of desperation.
And that's the last. We're gonna get in. Yeah, keep going because the last paragraph you can weave right into this last paragraph if you want.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna read it just so.
No, that's good. So what this paragraph right here refers to the story that Joseph Campbell tells. It's not really a story, but it's sort of an image that he gives. So in temples all around the world of all different types of religions, when you walk into the temple grounds, or like if you go into a church and stuff, often there's like gargoyles guarding the doors, and there's like all these beasts outside, like lions and tigers and bears. And so, and the thing is, so we often imagine that these beasts are there to keep the unworthy from going in, right? And but really they're a part of like this the process of step one, right? Like those beasts are the things that actually do the severing. They're the things that cut the ego down to prepare it to enter that holy space. So it's very similar to like just the step one experience that we all go through on our way to the door of our first meeting, right? And I also make the case that the greeters, right? Like they're like sort of like those devils or those guardian, beasts that are standing outside the doors that the newcomer just can't even stand to look at, right?
Yes.
And so, but something happens, right? When we pass through the door, the secular sort of like old self is left behind. That's the annihilation of the old self.
There's so this kind of everything that we're talking about, this is like this last paragraph. I love the last paragraphs of all books. I really feel like a lot of times things are summed up. And you use the word thus. Like, in a lot of books they go therefore. You use the word thus a couple of times at the end of some of these chapters. And you, generally speaking, when there's the thus or therefore, it's a wrap-up. It's a good thing. And this is what it says right here. I'm going to read this again, and we're going to talk about this because I think this is like one of the keys. It says, thus, the evils that drive us toward the temple door are what prepare us for the immense power and glory that awaits beyond the threshold. Those still outside who have yet to reckon with the evil of their own nature believe it is the devil who keeps them out. Now here it is. But those who have made it through did so by learning to recognize the devil as nothing more than one of the many masks of God and, paradoxically, the bringer of the greatest blessing they could ever have been given, the collapse of the ego at depth, the spiritual depth that is translated in the 12-step meetings as G-O-D, the gift of desperation. In the end, we come to recognize that it was the devil who first unlocked the transformative powers of the universal mind, preparing us for the awful event of the meeting with, say it,
the Numinoso.
Numinosos taking place inside. So that's when I read that, I thought to myself, oh, this is the opinion, when you talk about the archetype of the alcoholic. So when I think of it, I think of like, what did we say the other day? The archetype was the definition of something, right? You were doing it with me. It was Joe. It's like we go, what is it? I go, we gotta like, what is the actual meaning of it? So it's like, so the archetype. So it's through this lens right here that we truly find that numinosis, the event that transpires that makes it become for me, when I looked at it, it was like finding that higher power, finding the reason to believe, the catalyst behind it all. And I think this sentence alone is what, this paragraph alone is what would spark somebody to go, hey.
I think you unplugged.
Hopefully we had sound. Was that even going? Did you even check to see? Was there even sound? But one of those guys would have came. Was there sound? Okay, well, either way, it would have picked up anyway, so it unplugged. Yeah. But yeah, man, that's like a, our guy didn't have his headphones on, checking the sound. But hey, I feel like, hey, one job. You know what though? I really like one of the things I said. I like reading. I think the first time I actually read a book, the first book I ever read was Master of the Game. I was in the LA County Jail, and I had never really read a book all the way through. Yeah. And then once I started reading fictional books while I was locked up in jail, I found it was like watching a movie. And then when I found Alcoholics Anonymous, and I started reading the big book, then I started listening to what other people were telling me in meetings. They said, go read A New Pair of Glasses, or go read The Four Agreements, or The Voice of Knowledge, these books from different authors, and As a Man Thinketh, He So Doeth. And I remember early in my recovery, I would listen. Somebody told me, hey, go to meetings and listen to what other spiritual what's available spiritually, because there's, we have to enlarge our spiritual life through, not just self-sacrifice and constant thought of others, but it is through literature. It is through, increasing our vocabulary, or just, new thought, new information. And so this book has the power to do that if you're willing to go a little bit deeper, because like you said, Joseph Campbell, William James, Carl Jung, and there's even some other people, but those were the main ones that, as I was looking at some of the, the footnotes and where you're getting some information, it just opens up a whole new world of recovery and spirituality and understanding, from a psychological perspective. But the catalyst is always what stood out to me right here. It's through the ego, through the death of self, through the blowing up and annihilation of our life, that we finally get to a place where we become willing to accept this idea of I guess you could say, when a vital spiritual experience that takes place, even like I said, from us just talking right now. But yeah, so I thought that was a really, I don't know, I thought that, there's a couple other chapters in here that, I want to kind of go over because, this covered the numinosum. And this is where the beginning starts a lot of times. So you got like on this journey, let's go. I got like my footnotes here to keep us on track here.
Cool.
Not that we don't really have any track or anything like that.
Yeah, no, it's chill. We're good.
Yeah, we're good. So, I mean,
we can edit all this out.
We're not even, it's all live. There ain't no editing. We just like run it. We don't even give a shit. We got all kinds of cool stuff. At the end of the day, it's like we can just talk about whatever we want, just kind of.
Yeah.
And it's a really long title. So the shadow of a figure of light, right? So we've got the shadow. What is the shadow?
Well, that's a good question. The shadow's that part of us that our wives can see, but we can't. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. So, okay, break it down. So the shadow is, so I've like, one of my famous quotes, well, it's not my famous quote. I say this, I've always come, I make, in my head, I'll go to a meeting and I've spent tons of time thinking about shares. And every time I watch a good movie, I see something and I go, I'll use that in a share. And it was, I forget what movie it was. It's either High Plains Drifter or it's a Clint Eastwood movie. And it's the one where he's getting ready to go face all the enemies or whoever he's up against, right? And the girl in the room goes, aren't you afraid? Aren't you afraid of whatever it is? And he looks at her and goes, he says, the thing a man fears the most is what he knows about himself inside. And so when I look at the shadow, right, and the shadow self, see, that's, to me, when I look at my myth, the thing that I'm afraid of most, it's not relapse, it's what I know about myself inside. So when now the myth creation for all of us, whether you're in this room right now or you're out there in social media land or whatever, is we're writing our own myth on a daily basis. And it's like, it is literally like a Roman or Greek mythological story that we create, embellish, and like literally embellish to try to get a point across, to get our message across. And a lot of the storyline, and there's another section in the big book, or not in the big book, but in your book, where you kind of go into the moment that, and I think, what was the writing of the big book? What's that book you got me, Gary?
Yeah. It's William Shaver. Writing the big book.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the writing of the big book. Gary got me that book. He got me this book too. And it's a great book too. And it kind of goes over how these myths are created, and what we believe to be true is, in essence, part of that embellishment factor, part of these things that take place, just like our lives. But that being said, the shadow, meaning I looked at that. The first thing I thought when I looked at the title of your book, The Shadow of a Figure of Light, was the thing I'm most afraid of inside. And then I don't know what a figure of light means. So I don't know if the shadow, what I just got done talking about, is relative to what you were thinking, but what is it for you?
Well,
I mean, you said it was the thing our wives know about us that we don't know.
Well, often the shadow's visible to other people, but it's not visible to us, right? So like, if I'm behaving poorly, like in my relationship, let's just say, like, and I don't even know, I probably make faces and talk rude, and I don't even know I'm doing it, but it would affect the person that I'm with, right? So, because I know she does that to me, and she can't tell. So I try to point it out, and it just pisses her off more, you know what I mean? So that's one kind of aspect of the shadow. But then there's these other aspects where we get in these sort of like unconscious dances with each other when we're arguing about something, and all of a sudden it's like I'm bringing up stuff. I'm not really bringing up stuff, but I'm like, I'm essentially reacting from this like traumatized young child, right? And she's doing the same thing. So now, rather than us communicating as present human beings, our really ancient traumas are going at it, right? So that's sort of shadow work too. But the shadow, like specifically the shadow, like the way Jung would describe the shadow, is it's that part of our psyche that's just beyond the horizon of consciousness, right? So we call the ego consciousness, like, to just grossly oversimplify it. The ego is everything that I'm aware of, right? And we say we're like addicted to the ego because we're so fixated on reasoning and trying to control stuff, right? The ego suffers from a delusion of control. Right. So like as an alcoholic or a drug addict, they'll try to control drinking, control using drugs. Then we try to control other people, right? That's the ego just kind of clutching onto this thing of power. So when the ego is sort of, that delusion of control is smashed, right? That usually happens through the shadow. So the shadow is the part of the psyche that's just beyond the reach of the ego, but it's kind of present. It's there. So when we say, like, for example, in step 11, we sought to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him. One way of interpreting that would be that we sought to improve our conscious contact with the unconscious. And if you look at the 12 steps, it is a process of making the unconscious conscious. And so if God is a symbol of something, it could be a symbol of the unconscious, of the part of the human psychology that we're not aware of. Like, we're aware that it's there, but we can't really pin it down. It's transcended. It's unconscious, right? It's beyond the bounds of what we can understand. And the 12 steps helps to bring the personal unconscious or the shadow to the light. So we start out with step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol. That's bringing the shadow conscious, right? We finally realize, like, holy shit, I can't actually control it, right? And that's a big aha moment, because this major unconscious component has become conscious. And then step 4 and 5 are good examples of shadow work, because we're essentially trying to write down stuff that we've never even told anyone, right? And it's scary. That's a scary process in and of itself. But then we go sit with our sponsor and basically go through this stuff, and hopefully, if we have a good sponsor, he or she will give us more feedback about parts of ourselves that we can't see. Why are we behaving this way? Stuff like that. And then step 8 and 9, same thing. We'll make amends or whatever, and we learn stuff about ourselves. We learn how our behavior affects other people. Maybe those other people give us some feedback, and we're open-minded because our sponsors told us to just do it and just shut our mouths, right?
Right.
And so as we grow spiritually, we're growing psychologically, because the shadow is becoming more and more conscious to us, right? And so we're getting, and as it becomes more conscious, we kind of get control over it in a way. Like it no longer dominates us the way that it used to.
So in simple terms, it could be also the flaws in my character, because a lot of times when you look at, like, the step work that you're talking about, basically the journey of recovery begins with uncovering, right, the flaws in my character, essentially. The first, and so I guess if the shadow then becomes all those things that are my flaws in my character. Yeah. And that's how I'm going to have a spiritual experience, so to speak, is when I start identifying that, becoming aware or conscious of, and, basically, essentially putting it pen to paper. How does the figure of light, like, is that the spiritual awakening, is once you have reached to the figure of light, meaning the hope?
Yeah.
What?
I mean, the shadow of it. So the figure of light, I mean, I think most, it's probably the higher power, right? So, because I talk a lot in there about how, even our conceptions of God, there's a shadow component, right? The devil is the shadow of, like, Jesus, for example, or the higher power has a shadow, right? Bill Wilson's higher power has a shadow in the big book, and that shadow element is called the self. He calls it the self. Carl Jung also called it the self, which is an interesting kind of
So then the shadow is the self.
Well, yes, but the self in Jungian terms is actually even bigger than that, because the self is sort of a personification of the unconscious, right? The collective unconscious even. Whereas for Wilson, he calls it just like, it's like more almost like just the personal shadow is what he calls self. But I guess in both instances, though, what's really taking place is that the self is creating these unmanageable situations to get the ego's attention, so that it makes that third step decision. And that's sort of the whole process. So the shadow of a figure of light it's almost like meant to be paradoxical, right? Like, it doesn't make sense that a figure of light would have a shadow. Like, does the sun have a shadow? It casts shadows, but does it have its own shadow? And so it's just kind of meant to it's just a paradox. I kind of stole it from something Jung had said. I don't know exactly what it was, but
right. Okay.
I just thought I'd make the book that title.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so that's where it kind of came from. It kind of like a little combination. That's part of your myth. You've created your storyline and pulled it from other stories too.
The archetype of the alcoholic too is the shadow of a figure of light, because and we understand this in the 12 steps, but I can assure you that the rest of the world has a really hard time with the word alcoholic and how anything good could come from calling oneself an alcoholic, right?
Yeah. I hated it. I honestly hated that term too. In the beginning, I was like, everybody saying that they're a grateful alcoholic. And it just came from like what we just read on the other page. It's like, I didn't realize that it was through that I would find this power greater than myself. It was through that, through the total, like you called it the devil, and through the evil and through the lens of that, I found all this greatness that like literally if the scorecard read, this, you even said is, I think somewhere in there, the alcoholic says he doesn't like if he got what he deserved, right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't even be sitting here right now, and that's a fact, And so, but through that annihilation and through that, those choices that I made, somehow I found it to Alcoholics Anonymous, and now I actually truly do know what it means to be a grateful alcoholic. It's because of all the things that I get as a result of doing the steps and really taking my experience and sharing with others, like what you're doing right now. The journey, how would you describe what the turning point in this book, if you were to just go and try to go, okay, so where do we go from here?
Well, that's a good question, is like, there's a lot of work to do, right? I mean, I think that the whole, really, if I was hoping that the reader would get something out of it, it would be to begin to understand the shadow and to make the shadow conscious. Jung said that a man or a person does not attain enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, right? And so, and that goes against everything we talk about in terms of spirituality and religion in the West, right? Like it's all about the figures of light.
Right.
And even in the 12 steps, right? Like the higher power, it's all good. Everything's supposed to be good. But there's a lot. So Jung likens this process to sort of, it's like an electrical current or an electrical circuit. If we only had positive, like it's like we want to eliminate the negative electricity to make a better electrical charge. That doesn't actually work. The two of them have to come together in a common channel with equal and balanced power in order to create usable energy. So we need to stop trying to pretend that we don't have a dark side. I mean, the steps address the darkness, the defects of character, the shortcomings. And I just think that we need to stop guilt tripping ourselves because we're struggling with something or we have a dark side or whatever it is, because just like alcoholism or drug addiction, that's the catalyst that moves us towards spiritual growth, right? And that's why the archetype of the alcoholic is powerful, because if I'm willing to say, hey, I'm a grateful alcoholic, being an alcoholic was the best thing that ever happened to me, that's a pretty big statement. And it's true. It's a true statement because it got me to where I am today. It gave me this perspective of the world, and it allowed me to tap into a spiritual energy that I couldn't access before. So if that's true in the case of alcoholism, then it must be true in the case of all of the other character defects that I struggle with.
So let me ask you this then. What if you could describe to us, we go through this, you've been through this process, you've obviously, since you've already identified the book, the title, what is your personal experience with your own shadow?
Well,
and what does that look like?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's so.
What did you find? Like, who the fuck are you?
Well, I can tell you where I struggle today. I struggle with intimacy with men, right? That's like my big thing. Like I kind of feel like I don't know, like I had a female therapist and it was great, like there was a connection and stuff. And I realized like with men, there's this sort of like blockage. Like I don't really understand how other men are like getting along in the world. So that's my shadow work. That's where if I'm to do some real like internal like heavy work, that's where I need to focus, right? But there's a lot of shadow stuff. you know, the relationship is you know, Jung said we don't become whole like in as isolated beings. Like we have to be in relationship with other people.
Right.
And I find my relationship with my wife to be a very fruitful endeavor because we're both doing shadow work. And so when we get in these little tiffs and stuff, like there's a lot that's happening, like this sort of reactive posture that I get into, and to be able to step back from that and try to, you know, put a finger on where it comes from. Why do I feel this way? And to try to recognize how my actions affect her, like in the moment. And then also to give her the space to be mad at me, right? Like if she's like super upset and yelling at me, my tendency is to just basically turn off and be like, whoa, you're upset. You know, something must be wrong with you. That's what the book says or whatever, right? Whereas like,
yes,
really,
you're wrong with, what's wrong with you? It's not me.
Yeah, that's your problem.
I love that.
You're upset. That's your problem.
Right.
That's my kind of go-to attitude. So I find it to be really useful. And I think this is also shadow work for me, is to give her the space to be mad and to try to listen and pay attention and to see through the anger and to really like, even though I get feeling super defensive and stuff, is to try to like discount that and you know, I'll feel the feelings, but still listen to what she's saying and try to figure out what it is that I'm doing that affects her, and if I indeed need to try to change something. So I think that's shadow work too. You know, you do a lot of shadow work.
So in other words, like, so I kind of like what you just got done saying reminded me of something. I've just been recently divorced, and I think that what I failed to do was what you just got done describing. See, because anytime that it got loud or we got argumentative, it affected me in an egotistical way, and it didn't allow me to actually listen to what she was saying. Instead of, it was more of a perspective. It was like she was coming at me sideways, and there was something wrong with her for coming at me like that and not actually listening. And I think that that's probably like a big deal. And I think if I was to, when I say, what is one of my shadows, I would have to go back and say, because one of the things we learn in the 12 steps is like, what did I do? You know, what would I do differently? You know, how it affects me, and not just me, but other people. Because if there's one thing that we learn, that I've learned, is that every time I hear somebody say something like what you just got done saying, it just immediately took me back to, and what happens, I think, a lot of times, especially for me, and I think, you know, sharing like the spiritual experience that I'm having right now, is I look at my behavior always, and I've learned to like try to grow from your experience, right? And I hope that other people will listen to what we're saying and go, hey, maybe I can grow from that too. But I immediately would shut down and not actually like participate in that conversation anymore, because it just would escalate, and I didn't allow her, so to speak, to actually say what she thought and what she really felt. And I think that that's like, because all of life is about relationships, right? Whether it's like with the guys you meet or the girls you're with or whatever, whoever it is and wherever it's at, how does the ego, like when you look at your shadow self, when you look at that, what is the, like if you look at what is the biggest instance, like I learned from that. What have you learned from your ego in terms of what situations led you to that? Was there some kind of catalyst between you and that led you to realize that? Like,
yeah. So we've, you know, my wife and I, we've been together for a long time, the whole time we've been sober, and a couple years before, and we've had a good relationship, but around 2016, 2017, she, and really 2018, she really started putting on the pressure of like, hey, I want to see a counselor, like a therapist, you know what I mean? A relationship, a sex therapist, whatever. And so we went through a few of them, and I always just sort of approached it with this kind of bad attitude that like, you know, I've had a spiritual awakening. Like, what, you know, you're the one that's got the problem, you know.
That sounds like me.
Yeah. No, I think it sounds like most of us. Interestingly, so we finally actually found this therapist that's just amazing. We still work with her today.
Yeah.
And for some reason, she just spoke my language. And so I became really open-minded. I was like, hey, let's do this. All right. And I think that there was just enough understanding on both parts where I was like, okay, she's not going to let my wife get off the hook, right?
Right.
And so I felt good. Like, all right, if you're going to hold both of us accountable, let's do this. So her first suggestion was that we get our own therapists. And I was like, okay. So I you know, and keep in mind, I'm definitely pro therapy, but I'm doing the 12 steps. I'm like, I have home groups and sponsees, the whole thing, right? So, but
you're way more enlightened than her.
Well, I mean,
obviously,
but
that's obvious.
But what happened to me was it was a really interesting experience. I was sitting
writing books.
I was sitting outside of a diner with a good friend of mine in the program who has a lot more time than me and who struggles with relationships. And he once again was bringing this new relationship, and it was just the same old story.
Yeah.
And we all knew it was going to end bad, him included. And he's like, I know this is crazy, you guys. I get it. This is crazy. It doesn't make sense, but I'm fully conscious of what I'm doing. And so it's okay. And when he said that, I had a moment of reflection where I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what I say. That's my attitude to a T. And if that's what it looks like, I need to take this therapy thing seriously. And I had a therapy appointment the next day, and I just told my therapist, look, I'm going to do whatever you say. I'm going to I don't know. I'm not going to pretend I know how this is supposed to go. I'm going to approach this the way I approached the 12 steps when I was brand new, which was, I don't know anything. I've gotten to this point with my best thinking, and I need help. And when I did that, things really started to shift, because I started to, the first thing you do, I guess, is you kind of go back in life and you look at your childhood and the way your parents were and the way you interacted with your parents and your siblings and all that stuff, right? So I began to piece together these really old patterns of communication and emotional reactions and stuff. And then I could bring them to the relationship with my wife and talk about that. And so that we started to understand why I do certain things when she does certain things. And and if you bring enough presence to it, then it really changes the nature of the relationship. So that's been a huge part of my story. And I find it really incredible, actually, because I was writing the book during the same time. And so the book sort of evolved as my own psyche was evolving. And so it's been a really wacky experience, because I've attained a certain level of individuation through doing so much therapy and also doing the 12 steps, right? And then doing this work in Jungian, thinking and thought and just, and so, yeah, the whole thing's, it's like
oh, yeah, you should have wrote this book a couple of years ago. I'd probably still be married.
It wouldn't be as good.
It wouldn't be as, but it's funny. It's like, I say that, I'm joking, I'm not, I'm half joking, not joking, because I do believe that, the hindsight's 20, regret. There's one thing about, I think there's things that we regret, Yeah. And then there's, what is it? Regrets are worse than resentment. Resentment's nothing, but regret is a strange thing, and it's something that you only takes place afterwards, because it's only after you gain insight, right? Mm-hmm. That the journey, it's always this journey. It's this path that we're on. To learn and to expand and know. And then sometimes you find things out later on that you regret, and I think that that's one of the things that I'm trying to avoid most in my life is not, resentments, you can let go of those. Those seems to be like, if I was there, I'm at fault, I don't need to have a resentment about that, but it's about the regret. And I think this is one of those, all of what we do is, for me, is when I get together with another man and share experience, strength, and hope, it always opens the door for new growth, Mm-hmm. And this moment is no different. And so I thank you again. Your book has been inspiring to me. You're an inspiring guy. You used the word individuation. That's another one of those words I wrote that down in my thing. So really quick, share with everybody individuation.
Yeah. So
and I know it's a Jungian thing, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of a therapy thing. Not necessarily
not
just Jungian.
Okay. Jungian. Is that how you pronounce that? Say it again.
Jungian.
Jungian.
Yeah.
Jungian.
Yeah, not Jungian.
Jungian?
Like Brigham Young.
It's Jungian. Not like that. Say it again. Jungian.
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 Yeah. So my friends tease me just from the way I say Jungian. I'm like, bro, Anyways.
You're like, bro. Jungian.
So individuation. So Jung borrowed the term from Nietzsche, and also William James did. So so Jung's whole kind of theory, I guess, is that the individual needs to become like sort of reach its potential, right? Like, so each of us has this potential, almost like a flower, right? Like a flower, like it has one purpose. It's to become a flower and then it dies. You know what I mean? And so each of us too has this, there's like an innate purpose within us, and we've got to bring it about. We have to nurture ourselves and grow, and the ego needs to do the work to let the self be expressed. The self wants to express itself through the human ego.
Right.
And this is a dangerous enterprise. We see in the 12 steps we don't all make it, right? We all kind of start on the path, but not all of us finish. And so the term individuation is to describe what the individual is supposed to become, the individual personality. And it also means to be indivisible, right? Like that, so that an individuated person is not really split between opposites. It's not a question of is that good or bad or right or wrong or up or down. So the archetype of the alcoholic plays in here, right? It's not, what people don't understand is how our attitude towards liquor or drugs is really one of neutrality, right? Mm-hmm. And if you decide to go drink, I might talk you out of it, but it's not a moral issue, it's never been, and so that's an individuated person. Like when Wilson says we found a position of neutrality, safe and protected, he's undivided, right? It's safe, protected, right in the middle.
Got it.
Yeah.
I like that. I do. I like that. That was good. That was good.
Good take?
Yeah, it was a good take on it, because there's a lot of these words. There's a lot of words in this book that are like, wow, I never really looked at it like that. And you do reference that exactly in the big book. And I like how you do a lot of referencing to the big book. Let me ask you this. Was there something that you were, what was the reason that you combined this new thought that you had? Like what brought the interest to combine and bring Jung in his philosophy? If there was a very small, in the writing the big book was in 1937, 38, and 39, right? Mm-hmm. There was no connection at that time other than a small, an experience that Bill had with, obviously they were reading the William James pamphlets, varieties. Those are some of the things that they were reading. They didn't have the big book, so they were reading all these other like spiritual books. That happened to be one of the prominent ones that they were following. Which came out of, and then there's the Oxford group, right? So when you look at Roland Hazard and you look at the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous and Bill Wilson creating, so how are you, because I know that there's a lot of chapters in there where you kind of like reference that, through Jung's philosophies that Roland Hazard brought to the 12 steps. What's the real connection for you there? Was it just that he'd mentioned, hey, you got to have a vital spiritual experience? Or where was the real depth that, because you spend a lot of time talking about Jung.
Yeah. That's the thing, is there's not a big theoretical connection between the two, right? And right. Roland spent about 30 days with Jung in 1926, and then it's possible he's had some more time with him in like 1931 or something. But even still, it wasn't enough for Roland to become a Jungian. And
to actually pass that along to Bill. Yeah.
Right. So the point that I'm making in the book is that there's something more sort of ethereal happening, right? So first of all, Jung stepped way out of bounds in terms of psychology in the 1920s to tell somebody, hey, I can't help you. You've got to go have a vital spiritual experience. That really flew in the face of everything that Freud was talking about. They were hyper scientific, and that's really Jung's kind of, it was like a big move for him into this world of like the numinous, right? To really encourage somebody to go have a spiritual experience. And really it was that Jung had just found his own myth. And so somehow Bill Wilson then, he hears about this, that I should have a vital spiritual experience. And he essentially starts kind of trying to figure out what that might look like. And William Schaberg says that Wilson essentially writes the 12 steps, and that they for the most part emerge out of his own experience, right? So he borrows a couple tenets from the Oxford group, but that there's a whole bunch in the 12 steps that are just really Bill's experience, right? Like, this is what I did and this is what happened to me. And so So the connection then is something that it's more of a connection that's happening in the collective unconscious. And it's not something that like in the 12 steps we really have a good handle on, but like in the Jungian community, they understand this quite well, because the archetypes, they tend to sort of emerge in random places, in really different times. You know, there's cases where different symbols will pop up in completely different, you know, like a guy in a psychiatric hospital will have the same dream image that an indigenous tribe from Africa had, 700 years ago or something like that. So there's no way, and they're just these random symbols. That there's no way, it's just they're too similar to have just occurred spontaneously, even though they occur spontaneously. But the point is that underneath it all, there's a collective unconscious. Yeah. And so Wilson tapped into the same collective unconscious that Jung had tapped into. And that's the point that I'm making in the book.
Right. I think one of the things I said earlier when I first started out was about the set-aside prayer. Having a new experience, when I started going in the deep, I started, going down these rabbit holes through your book. And one of them was I started looking, there's when you're talking about let me find the page really quick. What page is when you talk about the circle squared, the circle square, where there's a picture of it, and here it is right here. This is the new God image chapter, and Wilson's symbol for AA, it says the triangle square accompanied with the words unity, service, and recovery inscribed alongside the edges, and how there's another image. You have the image of the unity, service, and recovery triangle circle. And I think I remember reading somewhere, I don't know if it was in which book it was, because in the beginning of the big book used to have that, used to be in the first pages. Like when you open up the big book, they used to have that on here, but they had to take it out for some reason, right?
Yeah.
There was some kind of copyright.
Somebody else copyrighted it.
But it was, what you had was, you showed this picture that comes from like, I want to say, the 12, art, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, Jung had printed that in his book. It's an alchemical symbol.
Yeah, and so that took me down so all of a sudden I started looking that up, and I started going down that whole path about the symbolism and stuff like that. So there's so much myth.
Yeah.
When I really looked at, because you use the word myth a lot.
I do.
So let's talk about the myth now.
Sure.
Let's get into the myth of it all.
Sure.
Like an individual myth, the myth of AA, the myth of God, the myth of this, the myth of that. And what does that mean?
No, I love that question, because everybody's our sensitivities are offended by the word, right? So and typically just in the culture in general, but also like really in some of my close friends couldn't read the book because they were like, I'm offended by the word myth. Like, here's the thing. We're talking about this vital spiritual experience. But there's also these academic folks, Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, William James, Nietzsche, right? There's a big tradition that they're also talking about the vital spiritual experience, but they're using different words to describe it. And one of the words they use is myth. So myth then is sort of the description of how these vital spiritual experiences have been expressed throughout the ages, right? Now, in today's hyper-scientific, hyper-rationalistic world, our myths have sort of lost their numinosity. They don't speak to the soul the way they used to. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And Jung was hyper-vigilant in this. That's why he went searching for his own personal myth. He needed something to answer to this mythless culture. And it just so turns out that Bill Wilson did exactly the same thing. That Bill Wilson, he realized he needed a vital spiritual experience, but he also recognized that he wasn't able to obtain that experience within the conventional religious structure, because those and Jung says the same exact thing, that those institutions have lost the power to produce a psychic change. And so Bill went searching for it on his own. And so what emerged is the myth of the 12 steps, right? That's one of the cases that I make. So I call the 12 steps a myth, but a myth as in that they're this sort of archetypal, prototypal experience that people of many walks of life all across the world are now experiencing, right? Just like they are Christianity or Buddhism or whatever. choose any myth, right? They're and the basic structure of myth is to describe the relationship between gods and humans. Okay, and the word religion means to bind fast. Similar is the word yoga, which means to yoke. And so the purpose of these religious stories or these myths is to bind the gods and the humans, right? That's the story of myth. And that's the story of the 12 steps, right? And there's a struggle between the gods and the humans, right? It's a problematic relationship, always, in every single myth. Myths are always full of trouble, full of violence, right? People are always dying. The gods are mad, right? Yeah. And this is also taking place in the 12 steps. And so, but psychologically speaking, the reason this is important is because it's what the gods represent and what the humans of the myths represent, right? The gods represent the self or the collective unconscious, right? This deeper part of the human being that wants to transform and that wants to be expressed. It's the flower that wants to become a flower, right? And then in myth, you have the human characters who represent the ego or consciousness. And so the struggle is between the ego, right? Who we think we are, all of our likes and our dislikes and this and that, the stories we tell ourselves, versus like this deeper part of ourselves, the self, right? This thing that wants to manifest through us. Like, what is our full potential? Like, what does it look like for me to become a flower, right? Instead of just, whatever I was going to become.
So when you said in the beginning, you talked about how you went to church at 17, and your parents sent you there. So you grew up essentially, what, a Methodist, a Baptist? Yeah. Where'd you grow up? What was it? I always go, those Methodists.
Should we tell them, dude?
Huh? Yeah, wait. Yeah, so were you you were a Methodist?
No.
No, I'm just kidding. Well, that's a kind of a joke. I grew up in a Methodist church.
Really?
Yeah.
No, that's cool. I grew up in Southern Utah, so it was Mormons.
Okay.
But, say what you will about the Mormons, they're Christians at heart.
Yeah. Now, I have a couple, I know some really cool, they're cool. I don't have anything bad to say about Mormons.
If anyone on my Facebook feed is watching this, I guarantee they're Mormon.
Yeah. No, that's cool. But I have a lot of friends that are, I wouldn't say a lot, but I have a few. The friends that I have that are Mormons are like absolutely like some of the best people I've ever met in my life.
Yeah. Right.
100%.
Right. So, but that's just the Christian myth, right?
Yeah.
So, and what you see in there is this struggle between the gods and the humans, and just like in the 12 steps,
So then I take it you're not a Mormon anymore.
No.
Okay.
I'm not.
All right, that's fair.
No, I was at a certain point, and
but your family still is, right?
Well, they're not practicing Mormons.
Okay. Is that a subject you talk about much, or?
I'm happy to talk about it. It's like we didn't grow up as a religious household or anything. I became pretty religious when I was, between about 17 and like 21 or 22. I read books a lot like the one that I wrote. That's where I got introduced to Joseph Campbell, and I used to read these really deep dives into like biblical scholarship and stuff. Just because I just liked it, I don't know why, it just appealed to me. So, and I always wanted to write a book when I was young. So, when I started writing this one, I knew I was going to write this kind of a book with the footnotes and the stuff, sort of an academic flavor.
Mm-hmm. So you think that having like a background in religion, how did that play a role in, obviously your sobriety and the journey that you're on to your enlightenment? How did it play a role in the beginning, the middle, and where does it play a role in it at this point in your journey?
No, I appreciate that. So it's really a strange subject for me. So I don't have any hard feelings or anything against any religious organization. I'm kind of like I'm with Bill Wilson, like, to each their own.
Yeah.
Surprisingly for me, I had a white light experience before I ever came to AA within the church, but it was really before I had gotten really involved in the church. So I wasn't very indoctrinated.
Okay.
And I just had like a very kind of innocent, almost like, this spiritual experience. Like it just happened to me. And then I started to sort of, the meaning I started to put on that experience was within the framework of the church, right?
Right.
Which is fine, whatever, human error. But as I tried to get sober then, that experience actually became quite prohibitive for me because, it's like, well, I've already had a white light experience, and most of the people in the 12 steps haven't really had one. So what am I going to learn here besides not drinking? And having that attitude, see, my ego had really kind of built a fortress on top of that experience. And, in this sense, alcohol was a great blessing for me because it finally broke down those walls.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
grateful alcoholic.
That's right.
Yeah,
I'm a grateful alcoholic.
So it played a huge role, though. Really, kind of like. So I mean, think about it. Let's go back. When you said it no longer was working for me, that meant the church or the rooms.
So
or a combination thereof.
Well, the church. So I had an experience. I ended up relapsing.
Okay.
Not from AA, but just I had 5 years dry. I went on an LDS mission. I went to Argentina, came home, got married, had a couple kids.
Okay.
But I just couldn't really cope. I was all over page 52, as we say, right, with the bedevilments.
Okay, yeah.
And I ended up drinking again, and then quickly got divorced, and then ended up getting arrested shortly thereafter. And when I went to rehab, my counselor, she's a great woman. She she sat me down one day, and I don't know how I was able to eke this out, even looking back. But I basically said, I don't think God's going to help me because I've been a bad boy. You know what I mean? Like I'm not deserving. I'm not worthy of God's help. And she said, well, Cody, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And for whatever reason, I was very open-minded in that moment. And so whatever conception I had, Bill calls it the czar of heaven. I essentially dethroned the czar of heaven right then. I walked outside and decided that Mother Nature was going to be my higher power. And I never really turned back. I never looked back on that. Mm-hmm. So I was willing to let that conception just sort of fall by the wayside. And that's what, if you know that story about me, you see that throughout the book. I talk a lot about this changing God image, right? Mm-hmm. That Bill Wilson, we're all sort of born with this image of God, right? Being in the West, it's our inheritance. And that true spiritual transformation happens when we start to reckon with that God image in a very honest and authentic way, which is what we do in the 12 steps, right? Because we have a hard time relying on that God to save us. And so someone says, well, just choose your own conception. And we do, and then it becomes a numinous thing, right? But the journey then is to go full circle, right? And then you begin to see that original God image as actually being valid, right? It's just that I was relating to it in the wrong way. It's so that image is meaningful and powerful, and it's there, but it's just another symbol. And so that's the figure of light, right? I'm not going to attain enlightenment by chasing that figure, right? I need to find enlightenment actually comes in the dark. So that's sort of a brief rundown of that, just how that image, I guess how my own experience played into my conception, because my story is not in the book, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. But what is in the book is my conception of spiritual transformation and spirituality.
All right, that sounds. It's funny. I find that a lot. I don't know if it's funny or not, but it's interesting. There's a growing number of people in the rooms in the community that have these experiences, and one of the things I think when I first started reading the book, it seemed to me like the direction that you were going was to equate the origins of AA that derived from a more psychological approach than, say, like the Christian Oxford Washingtonian approach, what is so readily described and ascribed, so to speak, myself included. It says somewhere in the book that the main purpose of the book is to find a power greater than yourselves that could help solve your problems, and this means we're going to talk about God.
Yeah.
And the most of the, if you want to call it the myth of AA, is that this is a God, and I know that there's a part in your book where you go into, the God-inspired concept of how most people in Alcoholics Anonymous, as far as the 12 steps go, have this a deep this sense of divinity that comes from, like, even in you even quoted in your book about when Bill recounts how he wrote the book and it just came to him, and this is the myth of, this would be considered, I guess you could say, the myth of AA, is because there's, in the other book that Gary had gotten me, what's it called again?
Writing in
the Big Book. That was a good, so they kind of go into detail about how a lot of these things are embellishments, and that, obviously Bill was using his skill as a salesman, a marketing guy, a business guy, and then also somebody who wanted to carry a message that was going to have what they call depth and weight, that people say, a story that people would buy. Yeah. And he goes into this description of how it just flowed out of him, these 12 steps, and this just happened. And then there's all this contrary information to what he actually said, right? And the theme that is taking place, and I hear this, I'll go to meetings and I'll hear guys talk about this, and I do believe and I understand that everybody has their journey and their experience to go by, but it's like this push to divert people from accepting that the vital spiritual experience is this understanding and this relationship with the higher power, meaning that left to my when I've tried to do this alone, it never worked. Obviously, I get into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and I hear the message from other people that they found a higher power, they got this God in their life, they turned their will and their life over to the care of God, and as a result of doing those steps, taking that action and building the cornerstone, and you even use that term, the cornerstone of and the foundation of our recovery is this relationship with a higher power. Right? But then there's this theme, and even like what you're saying is like, now I'm on this journey of, it's more of not so much the spirituality of the Jesus-centered movement, God movement that got us here, but it's more of, hey, you know what, God of my understanding, and now it's this group of drunks or good orderly direction, which I agree with 100%, because without Alcoholics Anonymous and the people in the meetings, essentially God's not talking to me directly. What he's doing, he's talking to me through each one of you. He's showing me through the testimony of other people that my experience and the experience that they have, and you even mentioned this too, whether it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong, right? Whether the experience is true or not. I think it's one of Freud, or not Freud, but it's one of Jung's.
James.
Is it James who says that? Mm-hmm. It's not whether it's right or wrong. It's whether it's the tale I'm telling myself, right?
Yeah, it's his notion of radical empiricism.
Yeah, it's
that. Yeah, the truth of any experience really depends on the meaning that I inject into the experience.
Exactly. Yeah. So that becomes really, why is it, do you think, that people, like, if to me it makes me want to go, if the third step prayer says, I bear witness to God's power, his love, and his way of life, right? Mm-hmm. Then that becomes the thing I'm hanging my hat on. I go around and go, hey, listen, this is, on my own I can't do this, but first there's God's power, the thing that got me here, his love, the thing that keeps me here, and his way of life, what I teach other people, and that's how this program works. That there seems to be a message of like, hey, you know what? It isn't really so much about like, and I get it, God is your understand, God, choose your own conception of God. But do you see that as a thing that's happening amongst yourself and other people, where it's like we're trying to get away from the real God spirituality thing and trying to focus more on the psychology of it?
Well, I don't see that actually. So I see it the other way. I think that we're sort of kind of addicted to the story of the Oxford group story, right? That but it's very interesting to me that Bill Wilson, he really abruptly turned away from the Oxford group in 1937, a couple months before he started writing the book. Mm-hmm. He was, and it shows it in his journal. Shaberg talks about this in writing the Big Book, that Wilson and Lois were going to Oxford group meetings 2 or 3 times a week, and then all of a sudden in April of 1937, they don't ever go back. And so he turns really abruptly from the Oxford group, and then he writes the chapter, There Is a Solution. That was the first chapter he wrote. It's now chapter 2. He thought it would be chapter 1, and he opened There Is a Solution in the early drafts with the story of Roland Hazard going to meet Carl Jung. And then he also introduces James and the Varieties of Religious Experience in There Is a Solution. Oh. So Bill Shaberg says that There Is a Solution can be seen as Bill Wilson's Declaration of Independence from the Oxford group.
Oh.
And so...
See, learning new things right now.
Yeah.
It's freaking awesome.
Right. So whatever reasons... And so the question then becomes, right, what did Wilson really inherit, or what did he absorb from the psychologists? Because he didn't know that much about their ideas.
No.
He wasn't steeped in psychological theory, right? But what he did get from through that channel is the concept of the personal mythos, right? The thing that Jung had found, the personal myth. That was able to get through, and that's what Wilson fixated on. And that is the spirituality of our program. And so even though we don't really know it, the irony is that what Wilson gets from the psychologists is actually the spirituality of the 12 steps. Because both William James and Carl Jung were very deeply spiritual people, and they were on their own spiritual journeys. Their spiritual journeys they're more representative of the 12-step journey that we take than I would say than even the Oxford group is.
Right.
The Oxford group is a Christian organization, but both James and Jung were really practicing what Stephen Herman calls spiritual democracy, right? Which is really, summed up in the idea that you could choose your own conception of God.
I like it. What let's see, what time we got here? 3:35. I think we're doing pretty good.
How long are you gonna go?
I guess we could kind of get to, well, let's just, I don't know, I just kind of there's really no time limit. I just kind of roll with it. I know we'll just kind of end with this. Like, I think we got a lot of good stuff here. I think the most important thing is that we've got, like I said, the opportunity. One of the first thing I heard in meeting, my sponsor told me, go to meetings and listen to what other people do, and what they're doing to enlarge their spiritual life. It's not just and I think the most important thing that I did early in my recovery was do just that, take direction, and I would go and I'd listen to people talk about other books that they read to enlarge their spiritual life. And so, that being said, in the beginning, I started reading your book, and he's going to talk about psychology, and, me, I'm like, now, Joseph Campbell, what do you know about Joseph Campbell?
I mean, I think I know a lot.
Is he part of the Campbell Stone movement?
I don't think
or no?
so.
No. I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know what I'm talking about. But what I do know is that, like, all of the things that I've learned in Alcoholics Anonymous was, like, from other people and from listening to what other people did to stay sober and the journey they've been on and the books that they read, in addition to the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 and 12 and AA-approved literature. And so I really think that this is one of those books and this opportunity, like I said, that I started reading into it, and I started going in all these different rabbit holes, that I really appreciate and will continue on my journey of recovery, so that I can be more enlightened and grow, because even like, the Sober Voyager podcast, it's about the voyage of recovery. It's about how do I navigate life today? And generally, it's with other people. The most important part about recovery for me has been the people I meet in the rooms and the people I meet in life in general, and what I can get and what I can, I guess, emphasize most is that this is another book that we have an opportunity as 12-step people, or not 12-step people, people that are looking to find out what they're, and kind of, I've been on these like dating apps, right? And there's these things people say that are so stupid, like women, they say, hey, if you haven't done the work, don't call me. I'm thinking, fuck, what are they even talking about?
Is
anybody? It's
app?
stupid. It's so dumb. I feel embarrassed even saying that. But since it is a show about being stupid, right? You could edit that. Yeah, start talking about it. But it's funny though, because when you say it, it's like we do the work, like the shadow. We're doing the shadow work. We're looking at ways to enlarge and increase and improve our perspective on spiritual awakening and spiritual experiences that we can have. So with that being said, that could be conclusive. I'm so grateful that you wrote this book, and that I've had a chance to get into it with you right now, and share it with the people out there. And I hope everybody goes to your website, picks up the book. Are you got any other events planned where people can go see you, or you're doing any book signings or anything like that?
I don't have anything set up yet. I will. I'll be presenting in the Jungian Institute in Los Angeles pretty soon.
When's that? Is that coming up?
I don't know exactly yet. I have to submit, and they'll go through their process. I'm going to be in Dublin in May.
Nice.
And then I'll be in Switzerland in 2026. So if anyone wants to come.
Oh wow!
That's what's set up for now. So the book just launched in November. So
okay.
I actually did a thing last night in Laguna. That went pretty good.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah, it was good. It was fun.
Were you presenting?
We watched the Joseph Campbell video, and then I presented for 30, 45 minutes.
Nice.
Answered questions, and yeah.
Cool. So you're on tour.
I'm on tour, yeah.
Right on. So we'll just leave it with that. Hey, everybody, just like, subscribe, share, go to his website. If you can, we want to get as many viewers on our YouTube channel, on Facebook, Instagram, whatever it takes. Our goal ultimately always is to bring recovery out there, to bring inspiration, to bring change, and bring interesting guests that have done great things in recovery. So thank you again, and I want to thank everybody behind the scenes here doing all the good work, and we look forward to hearing from you again, and hopefully you'll come out and visit again.
Yeah, man. Thank you.
All right, man.
Thank you.
Cool deal.